Hi, I'm Andy Brown. This is the first video of our spring 2021 course in epistemology. And so I want to tag that here at the beginning. Also tell you that we're going to be always at the end of these videos. I'll be giving you a video every week, maybe sometimes even more than that if I have them. And then on the topic page on Moodle, you will also find then always a list of links that I've selected to pass on to you to go along with the video. So as well as the reading, of course, if there is a specific reading, and oftentimes the links will also take you to articles and readings. In this case, today we're going to talk about the Theatetus. Let me put that up on the screen for our wonderful, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about Plato's Theatetus. I say here it's the cornerstone of epistemology. Really is epistemology, the logos of the episteme, the study of the theory of things or the study of knowledge. So just to give you that very broad picture there, in a sense we can divide, there's a way that we can think of dividing philosophy into two topics that make something philosophical. We think of one as metaphysics, the study of being, the sort of study of what exists. I won't dwell on that right now, but the standard example that I use, not to make any kind of point, only because I know that it's an example that everyone already knows about, is if we're asking ourselves about, say, the existence of God and the relationship between the existence of God and the relationship of and the existence of the world. So again, that would be an example of metaphysics. And then the other part of philosophy then, epistemology, the logos of the episteme, the logos, the study of knowledge, as I said. And the interesting thing about Plato is that he very much anticipates, someone says, I think it's Alfred North Whitehead who says, maybe it's Bertrand Russell, that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato or something along those lines, meaning Plato seems to anticipate many of the standard questions and traditions in philosophy, in the European tradition of philosophy, and not just the European tradition of philosophy, by the way. I think a more contemporary take on philosophy has a more international feel, and we see that some of the same things that we can find in Greek philosophy in the middle of the first millennium are things happening in other nearby regions of the world around that same time. All right, so we're going to talk about the Theatetus of Plato. What is this? The Theatetus is Plato's main sustained dialogue on the topic of epistemology. It is also one of the longer dialogues that Plato writes. Plato has a book, the Republic, which is a collection, well, the Republic is a collection of 10 books or chapters, as we call them, each one of which is structured such that it can serve as another dialogue. These dialogues have the protagonista, Socrates, who's usually engaged in conversation with various different people. There is always some significance to the characters, the density of the text. It is very dense. From our sort of naive picture of Plato when we first start to read Plato, it seems like we sort of go from one kind of slightly strange argument to another, and we have to sort of memorize these arguments, and there's about 3 or 4 of them. In fact, if we really get into the text, we find a much denser conversation and back and forth of thoughts and ideas than that. But in any event, let's go back to our slides and get going with it, get going with epistemology, because I take it that, one of the things that we still want to work on here is what epistemology sort of is, what it consists of. Okay. There we go. So one way of looking at philosophy is as conceptual analysis. We think of conceptual analysis as a very, it fits, the phrase conceptual analysis fits English language, contemporary English language philosophy, which often has a concentration on language and logic. And so we looking at concepts and the way that concepts work, and that all sounds very modern, so-called linguistic turn in philosophy from about 100 years ago and so on. I forgot I had my psychedelic Grateful Dead shirt on. I always forget that this one does that. It's okay, it gives you something to look at. All right, so so it's this long text on epistemology. Where does it fit in? It doesn't much matter. One thing I would flag here, though, is oftentimes when we think about Plato, when we think about the Plato of the Republic, for example, we think about Plato of the form-matter distinction, form-matter duality. And certainly everything that Plato says in the Theatetus is consistent with his overall thinking, of course, and I'll explain a little more about what that system is there. But notice about the Theatetus that the questions that are asked about knowledge, about justification, about belief, about the relationship between facts, belief, knowledge, justification, these concepts, don't ever allude to any kind of dualistic transcendental theory of forms. If we want that, we can go to the Republic for that and some of the other dialogues for that. But the Theatetus asks what I would say are sort of secular questions, or the questions are phrased in what I would say is a secular way. That is, we don't have to think about Plato's metaphysics. We can see that the questions that are being asked are reasonable questions about what we mean by knowledge, belief, and so on. As always, the characters in the dialogue are real historical characters. Sometimes the dialogues are fictions, but the characters are always real, and the dates are very roughly real, although Plato will stretch it. There was a Theatetus who was a successful mathematician, in fact, a very renowned one, who later was wounded. The frame of this dialogue is that Theatetus has been brought back to Athens from the fighting, and he is shortly going to die, and Socrates has seen him and spoken with him very briefly. And so now he's remembering when Theodorus, the old mathematics professor, in fact, introduced Socrates to Theaetetus when Theaetetus was still just a young boy. He's maybe 13 or 14 here. He's very young. And so part of that, as with the slave boy in the Meno, is that Plato's demonstrating that these young, untaught people also have certain rational capacities, which according to Plato means that they lived in another life and so on. But again, that's his metaphysics. We don't need to worry about that. As usual, we have uniquely Greek sort of way of looking at things, sometimes interestingly odd. It's part of what's good about that literature, the ancient Greek philosophy. It stretches our minds because they have different ways of talking about things. But at the same time, you'll notice that, in fact, amazingly enough, I would say that the main structure of the Theaetetus actually sort of mirrors the structure of the epistemological discussion of the 20th century. Again, it's a very, very dense work. We're only going to be able to survey the main arguments. The first one of which is knowledge is perception. That might mean a lot of different things. If we were talking about philosophy later on, philosophy influenced by Descartes, if we were assuming that what we were talking about here was some sort of representational theory of mind, we would have one way of reading that, the meaning of that phrase, knowledge is perception. But it's not exactly clear what that means here. We do know that Plato and Aristotle have a distinction between what you could call sensation and perception. That is, sensation is kind of the sort of raw feel of a thing. But before you identify it, maybe the softness of the kitten, the very first time you touch it, and then perception is, oh, it's a kitten. So you see that difference, the difference between, let's call it sensation and perception. But one of the interesting things here is that we're not going to assume necessarily that we're talking about forming a mental representation. So what's going on here? Well, there is Protagoras, who says that man is the measure of all things. Plato is a realist. He is an objectivist about epistemology. Objectivist, foundationalist, That is, he thinks that the facts are the facts, and they are the facts whether or not anybody knows about them. The urgency he feels about that is he wants people to understand that you need to make some effort to go out and find out what the truth is. And he is developing that attitude in the context of an ancient Athens that he feels has been debased in its defeats and setbacks. However, he does have real arguments against relativism. But what I also wanted to say is he's well aware of these relativistic arguments. Sometimes people think it's a real mistake to read the ancient Greek philosophers and think, oh, well, they're naive because this is from such a long time ago. No, that's not the case. I don't think there are very many of these sort of basic positions in epistemology that Plato is not aware of and doesn't give us an account of. In this case, in the case of Protagoras, we have a perspectival relativism, that the reason that the hill goes up is because you're at the bottom. The reason that the hill goes down is because you're at the top. Now, Socrates points out a problem with that, because Theatetus, remember, is just a young boy. He's 13 or 14, still growing. So right now, Socrates is taller. And then later on, Socrates is going to be shorter when Theatetus is taller than Socrates is, because Socrates is kind of short, remember. So, but notice Socrates hasn't changed. And so the objectivist intuition is really that there's something wrong. The perspectivalist wants to say, yeah, Socrates is taller for Theatetus, and 3 years from now, Socrates will be shorter for Theatetus. But there isn't any such thing as really Socrates' real height. There might be an equivocation here on Plato's part. Think about this, on whether you've got the real height, which is fixed, and just say Socrates' height is not varying. So there's the real height that's fixed, and then there's the relative height relative to different things. And so, yeah, you want to know his real height, but the way we talk about things like height is often relative to other things. The objection seems to be that when we talk about height in that relative sense, we're suggesting that there is no such thing as height in any absolute sense. That's one argument. There's another argument, and this one is probably the main argument associated with both Plato and Aristotle in response to the relativists, such as it is. But it is this, that relativism can't handle error. And any theory of knowledge is going to have to explain to us how we can be wrong. Notice that the objectivist, the foundationalist, the objectivist who thinks that knowledge is an objective fact, the foundationalist who thinks that knowledge rests on some kind of foundation. So it's two sort of different ways of getting at the same idea. Right? So that person doesn't necessarily share this problem. Right? That person has an answer to this. Okay. So the basic criticism is you can't explain error. If everything is just whatever I say it is, then I can't be wrong. So. Simple as that. And after all, often I am wrong. And so you're invited by these philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, have that objectivist intuition from thinking about that. Say, well, what that really means is there really is something that's true, whether you know about it or not. Okay. So they do away with that. They say, well, that one won't do. But also in the end, by the way, in this dialogue, they don't, I think it's a kind of clever of Plato, and there's a few different things you could say about it, but it is striking that in the Theaetetus, at the end, Socrates says, well, we haven't come up with any kind of theory. We haven't really birthed any new ideas. So, but in this case, we say knowledge is true opinion. Now, there's another way of motivating our objectivist intuitions there, and that is to point out that you can have a true opinion by accident. You can have a true opinion by mistake. That is, so we think of We think of a causal theory of truth being that the idea is that the belief is anchored somehow in the outside world. Something happened. So maybe I just saw something with my own eyes. So that's the link that my belief has to the real world. You know, obviously I believe lots of things by testimony, but I'm hoping that if I went back far enough, I would find that the examples of other people's testimony also went back to these more basic sort of sources of knowledge. Okay, so, all right, so that's a causal theory of knowledge, that there's a sort of anchor in the real world, and there's a story, the causal links from that up to your having the belief that you do. And so, so the problem with the theory that knowledge is true opinion is that there are any number of ways you could come to have the opinion that happens to be true, but it's not clear that you actually know it if the reason that you believe it is not one that actually justifies it. Someone who's lying, someone who is trying to lie to you, for example, let me give an example because that's a little, I know that's kind of abstract. Listen, someone's trying to lie to you. They accidentally tell you the truth. So they told you the truth and now you believe it, and what you believe is true. Do you know it? Well, what's your intuition? It looks like you know it by accident. Okay, so, and then a couple of other sort of Platonic points, again, getting slightly closer to the metaphysical stuff, but not really. The other thing about this, to talk about rationalism then. It looks here that since we clearly see that we can make a mistake, and furthermore, we can see that one way of trying to avoid that is to look at the chain of causation that's links our belief to the world. And so all of that also speaks to the idea that it's really not about my passions. Specifically, it's not about how fervently I hold to the belief. I mean, this is a difficult thing about rationalism, I think, and part of the place where people sort of give philosophy a bad name, really, although I'm not totally sure it's wrong. I mean, the idea is just that, well, some of these things, you know, you can say, but I feel really strongly about this, but it really doesn't matter how strongly you feel about it, because what's right and wrong is not a matter of your opinion. And that's one kind of emotional essence of rationalism, sort of about self-control. So where do I control my passionate self? By going to the universal rational self. Because all of the other human beings also are rational beings. And in as much as we're rational and logical, we're all the same. Philosopher Kant also picks up on this idea. In as much as we're all physical and in our own perspectives and situations, as much as that is true, we are all different from each other. But where we can come together is at a rational level where we can see things objectively. Simple as that. So, all right, not hard to show that knowledge, that the true opinion is not going to do as an example of real knowledge. So justified true belief. Now, just to get it out of the way for that first bullet point there, the philosopher's name is Gettier, but there's a sequence in 20th century epistemology where you get to this justified true opinion or justified true belief, often people say, which all really comes out of this ancient Greek discussion in many ways. But it's not that hard to say that even that justified true belief, say the person who lied to you was lying to you for the first time, and you knew and correctly knew that they had never lied to you before, then you would be justified in believing it, and say they had also accidentally told you the truth, and then you would also believe something's true. But is that knowledge? It doesn't have the right kind of causal chain. Really, I think, in a sense, justification and belief really merge together and kind of run together. I'm not sure you can really make this distinction between justification and belief, which is maybe a paper idea, but what I'm saying when I say this is there are these causal processes of belief formation, and I'm not sure you can distinguish what you're calling justification in as much as something you would point to as a justifying narrative about your having come to have this belief. It looks like that's just going to be pointing at another causal process, right? And the sort of right kind of consistency of the causal process. Now, another thing I want to think about the way the last 3 bullet points there on the slide. Socrates calls himself a midwife and says he's trying to help other men deliver their ideas. The typical Plato thing to say. So, but what is going on there? Let's put aside maybe some of the obnoxious elements in him saying that. But so for one thing, Plato is really influenced by Heraclitus, even though we think of Heraclitus as one of his foils, right? And Socrates thinks that Heraclitus and his followers are a little silly. But Plato is influenced by Heraclitus in as much as Plato thinks that the material world is constantly going through change. Part of the reason why we can't have knowledge, firm knowledge of the world of matter, is because in the world of matter, things are constantly coming to be and falling away, coming to be and passing away. So, so one thing that Heraclitus thinks, Heraclitus gives us these aphorisms, these old axioms that are mysterious. Why? Because Heraclitus is trying to make us think. Why is Socrates always asking questions? Because Plato agrees that it's really the only way that teaching works is by making people think, because what you're doing is coaching people to think, learn how to think. So it's not about transfer of information, it's about practicing how to think. So what you're doing is trying to get the student or whoever, the reader, to think. And in fact, then Socrates is talking to these relativists in the Theatetus who say that everything is relative and there isn't any such thing as objective truth. And Socrates points out to them, or to, well, he's talking to Theatetus, but to these imaginary relativists, he would make the point that, look, you right now are saying something that you claim to be true when you say that you think nothing is true. If your doctrine, there's no such thing as truth, is true, and then immediately you're into a paradox there. There's a deep paradox right there in saying that there is no such thing as knowledge. Well, and so Socrates says essentially, look, you relativists, you can roll around on the ground and scream and cry, but at the end of the day, what you're going to be trying to do is figuring out what it is that you believe to be true. Because figuring out what we believe to be true is just human nature. In fact, it's the essence of human nature. The essence of human nature is to be rational, or what is to be rational just is to be always trying to figure out what is really true. And again, the philosopher Kant thinks something like this too, that the mind is kind of a theory-making machine. And Socrates adds, and this is a big part of Socrates as avatar, as protagonista for Plato in the dialogues, Socrates adds, that you try and figure out what it is that you believe to be true, first of all, to yourself. The very hardest way is to know thyself. And then state it as clearly and courageously as possible. Again, courageously, especially when you're talking to yourself. That's the definition of philosophy, of love of knowledge. Love of knowledge, quite literally, I love knowledge. I want to know what's true. Come what may, for its own sake, which is a question. Later on in this class, we'll do a topic on virtue epistemology, a modern movement that asks questions about ethics and epistemology. But notice Socrates' definition of philosophy. Philosophy is the activity of inquiring and asking yourself what it is that you really believe to be true, and then stating that as clearly and courageously as possible. so that it can be countered, by the way, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But Socrates says also, again, still thinking about those relativists, he says, look, relativists, this is human nature. This isn't only philosophy. What I just described and defined as philosophy is also a perfectly good description of human nature itself. Oops. Okay. So yeah, that's the last point that I did want to make. When we think of epistemology as being objectivist, one problem that people have with that, I'm not sure if it's valid. We're going to talk about epistemology and ideology in this class, but people want to be open-minded. I understand that people want to be open-minded and tolerant, but then objectivist can sound as if it's sort of an antisocial idea, in as much as it wants to insist that there's one right account and it wants to rule out or have some sort of no talk rules or something. Au contraire, as they would say in gay Paris, that's not at all the case. In fact, Plato thinks that, you know, as a person, as a thinking person who has that essence we were just talking about, you come into being in a polis, and that is to say, as a member of a political collective with other people to talk to. And remember, he's not Descartes. He doesn't think that you just have this immortal soul that's kind of observing from afar. He literally thinks there are degrees of reality. The wheel is a circle until it loses enough truth and it's not a circle, and that's just the shifting nature, the Heraclitean nature of the material world, just doing its unstoppable thing. So in order to actually even be a person, right? Because remember, people aren't static. You're not a person or not. You're more or less of a person according to this way of looking at things, depending on how much you're realizing yourself as a rational being. And so it's dialectic with other rational beings, right? Because the problem is I have to have some kind of control of my own passionate nature, which is blinding me to universal truths that apply to any rational being, rather than my own contingent passionate needs and desires, which only apply to me. So, and then look at this connection between language and thought. You know, again, something that is absolutely fundamental to the interests of contemporary philosophers in our time. And one of the things, I mean, so not only does Plato ask a lot of the same questions that modern philosophers do, but he even has a lot of the same methodological approaches. Now, but before you say, well, philosophy never changes, philosophy went through a lot of changes. And so it's all the more astonishing to find Plato 2,500 years ago doing something that from a philosophical eye today looks like a very sophisticated approach to philosophy. All right. And as I say, then just to finish that, I did also want to emphasize then that he is a social, you call it an organic philosopher, organic social theorist. Living in a society is an ordinary, natural thing for a human being. All right, so Plato's Theatetus, I think that's enough there. And you get some sense of epistemologies, you know, is it perception? Is it correct perception? Funny thing about truth is it's always going to have this sort of extra mental thing to it, because if as long as you think that truth is getting something that is corresponding to the way things really are. And then you start looking at all those concepts. We'll take a long look at a bunch of those concepts, this whole inner outer thing in our epistemology seminar. And as I said at the beginning, now in Moodle, when I post this in Moodle, there'll be a bunch of links, 4 or 5 links. You can also go do Google searches yourself and find all sorts of links yourself. But I'm going to always, if I may say, hand curate 3, 4, 5 links, depending on whether it's a link-friendly topic or not, as further things for you to investigate. Because really, in our kind of situation at Learning from a Distance, as I say in the introductory video that I sent to all the students this semester, You are going to have to educate yourself, but you always educate yourself. That's nothing new. It's only that now that's a little bit more exposed and to the light of day. It's a little more obvious what's going on. And my role as a coach is someone to sort of guide you a little bit and say, okay, here, go do this, and then try and maybe get some little more work out of you, which is why you have to hand in something every single week. You can't let it go and hand them all in at the end. I won't take it. Okay. That's what I'm doing. I'm your coach. I'm getting you to do. And think about it as flexing your muscle. I know you might remember some things, you might not remember other things when we're done, but you flexed your muscle a little bit every week, and that did you a bunch of good. That's what you're here for, okay? Let's try and have some fun with it. And take a look at Plato's Theatetus. Remember, I'll be having my office hours on Fridays at the usual hour for the class on Zoom. I'll send you an invitation right before the class. Attendance is voluntary, but if you have any questions about the reading or the assignments, you can check in there and I will answer any questions that you have. All right, bye-bye for now.